Pay no mind to the spill. It is merely wine.
Are you quite all right?
She sat completely unnoticed, among glittering jewels and loud laughter. Invisible, insignificant. Yet, one piercing gaze cut through across crowded tables, locking onto her plain gray dress. Within 21 days, this forgotten wallflower wore a duchess's crown, leaving high society gasping for air and desperately whispering her mysterious name. London, 1882. The season was at its most suffocating peak. Inside the sprawling, opulent dining hall of Lord Harrington's Mayfair estate, 70 of England's most elite aristocrats dined under the blazing light of a dozen crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant, heavy French perfumes, and the sharp, underlying tang of desperation. It was a marriage mart, disguised as a dinner party, and every mother in the room had her sights set on one man. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Blackwood. At 29, Arthur was notoriously wealthy, dangerously handsome, and fiercely unapproachable. He sat near the head of the table, his dark, tailored evening coat, a stark contrast to the colorful silks and satins worn by the peacocks surrounding him. He stared down at his untouched venison, his jaw set in a rigid line of boredom. To his left, Lady Genevieve Hastings was chattering incessantly about her recent trip to Florence, her voice a piercing soprano that was slowly giving him a migraine. And of course, Your Grace, the art was simply divine. Genevieve simpered, fluttering her eyelashes over the rim of her champagne flute. But nothing quite compares to the beauty of a London spring. Don't you agree? Arthur did not answer immediately. He took a slow sip of his claret, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the room. He despised these events. He despised the sycophants, the whispered gossip, and most of all, he despised the ticking clock in his own life. Thanks to a draconian clause in his late father's will, if Arthur did not take a wife before his 30th birthday, which was exactly 28 days away, the unentailed portion of his vast fortune, including his beloved childhood estate in Cornwall, would fall into the hands of his profligate, gambling-addicted cousin, Nathaniel. Arthur needed a wife. But looking at the sea of calculated smiles and greedy eyes, he felt entirely nauseated by the prospect. Far at the opposite end of the room, near the swinging doors of the kitchens where the draughts were cold and the lighting was dim, sat Miss Beatrice Linfield. Beatrice was 22, though her exhausted posture made her appear older. She was dressed in a remarkably plain gray wool dress that had been mended at the cuffs so many times. The fabric was stiff. As the orphan daughter of a ruined country vicar, Beatrice had been taken in by her aunt, Lady Margaret Hastings, Genevieve's mother, under the guise of charity. In reality, Beatrice was an unpaid servant, a companion, a seamstress, and a convenient scapegoat for whenever Lady Margaret's temper flared. Tonight, she had only been brought along because Genevieve's maid had fallen ill, and someone was needed to carry Genevieve's smelling salts, fix her hairpins, and sit silently out of the way. Beatrice was seated next to a deaf, elderly general who hadn't spoken a word to her, leaving her to silently observe the glittering spectacle of a world she lived in but did not belong to. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the intricate pattern of the damask tablecloth. She was used to being invisible. It was safer that way. The dinner progressed into its third agonizing hour. Footmen swarmed the room, carrying massive silver trays of spun sugar desserts. One young footman, looking pale and thoroughly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Harrington dinner, approached the section of the table where Lady Margaret and Genevieve sat opposite Arthur. The footman's heel caught on the edge of a heavy Persian rug. It happened in slow motion. The massive silver tray, laden with sticky, blackberry-soaked pastries and crystal bowls of cream, tilted dangerously forward. It was aimed directly at Lady Margaret's back and her obscenely expensive, pale yellow silk gown. Beatrice, whose eyes had been tracking the nervous footman out of sheer empathy, moved before anyone else even registered the danger. She didn't shout. She didn't gasp. She simply shot out of her chair, darted silently behind her aunt, and grabbed the edge of the silver tray with both hands, using her own body weight to violently yank it backward. The momentum saved Lady Margaret's dress. But the sudden jerk caused a crystal bowl of dark blackberry compote to launch backward, splashing heavily against Beatrice's chest and ruining the front of her plain gray dress. A heavy, stunned silence fell over that section of the table. The footman was trembling, perfectly white in the face. Lady Margaret spun around, oblivious to the fact that she had just been saved from public humiliation. She took one look at Beatrice's stained dress and the hovering footman, and her face contorted with vicious fury. "You clumsy, wretched girl!" Lady Margaret hissed, her voice low but dripping with venom. "Look what you have done to yourself. You are a disgrace to my household. Go wait in the carriage immediately. You are entirely unfit for polite company." Beatrice did not defend herself. She knew better. She kept her head bowed, her cheeks burning with a hot, humiliated flush. "Yes, Aunt Margaret, I apologize," she whispered. She offered a quick, reassuring glance to the terrified footman, a small, secret look that said, "You are safe. Let me take the blame." Then, she turned to retreat into the shadows. But as she lifted her chin to navigate her way out of the suffocating room, her eyes accidentally caught the gaze of the man sitting at the head of the table, the Duke of Blackwood. Arthur had seen the entire exchange. He had seen the footman trip. He had seen Beatrice's lightning-fast reflexes, deliberately sacrificing herself to save the very woman who was now berating her. And most importantly, he had seen that fleeting, compassionate look she gave the servant. In a room full of people wearing masks, this invisible girl in a ruined gray dress was the only real thing he had witnessed all evening. Their eyes locked. Beatrice froze. The Duke's gaze was intense, dark, and utterly consuming. It felt as though the noisy, crowded room had suddenly vanished, leaving only the two of them suspended in a vacuum of silence. Arthur did not look away. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his crystal glass of claret, tilting it just a fraction of an inch in her direction. A silent salute. A jolt of pure electricity shot down Beatrice's spine. Her breath hitched. No one ever looked at her. Certainly not men like him. Terrified by the intensity of his stare, she broke the connection, gathered her ruined skirts, and practically fled from the dining room. Arthur watched the doors swing shut behind her. "Such a pity about my cousin," Genevieve sighed, falsely sweet, leaning closer to Arthur. "She is dreadfully clumsy. We try to help her, but she is quite hopelessly awkward. Now, as I was saying about Florence." "Lady Genevieve," Arthur interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that instantly silenced the table around them. He did not look at her. His eyes were still fixed on the empty doorway. Who was that? Genevieve blinked, thrown entirely off balance. "I beg your pardon?" "The girl," Arthur said softly, his voice leaving absolutely no room for evasion. "What is her name?" "Oh, Beatrice." "Miss Beatrice Linfield," Genevieve replied, a sour note of jealousy bleeding into her tone. "But truly, Your Grace, she is a nobody." A slow, dangerous smirk touched the corner of Arthur's mouth. He set his glass down. "A nobody," he murmured to himself. "How fascinating." The following morning, the atmosphere inside the Hastings Mayfair townhouse was violently cheerful. Lady Margaret was pacing the drawing room in a state of frenzied triumph, dictating a list of new gowns to her exhausted modiste. "Did you see how he looked at her?" Lady Margaret crowed, gesturing wildly. "The Duke of Blackwood!" He ignored the Duchess of Richmond's daughter completely to sit by my Genevieve. "It is practically a settled matter. We must have a trousseau ready." Genevieve sat on a velvet chaise lounge, inspecting her manicured nails. "He did ask a rather strange question, though, Mama." He asked about Beatrice. Lady Margaret scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Only because the clumsy fool made a spectacle of herself. Men of his station abhor a scene. He was likely disgusted. Speaking of the little wretch, where is she?
I locked her in the morning room with the mending.
Genevieve said carelessly. I told her not to show her face until every one of those torn linens is repaired. Good. Lady Margaret smiled cruelly. She will stay hidden until the Duke has officially proposed. I will not have her dismal presence souring our triumph. Downstairs, in a windowless, drafty room near the scullery, Beatrice sat surrounded by a mountain of torn white sheets. Her fingers were raw from the heavy needlework, and her back ached, but her mind was entirely elsewhere. She could not stop thinking about the dinner. She could not stop thinking about him. The Duke of Blackwood's eyes had haunted her few hours of sleep. Why had he looked at her? Why had he raised his glass? It was a cruel trick of the light, she told herself. A trick of her own desperate, lonely imagination. Men who owned half of Cornwall and rubbed shoulders with royalty did not acknowledge penniless orphans dripping with blackberry juice. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the morning room swung open. It was Annie, one of the young housemaids, looking pale and wildly excited. "Miss Beatrice," Annie hissed in a loud whisper. "You have to come see. It's him, the Duke." Beatrice dropped her needle, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "What? Here? To see Genevieve?" "Well, he's in the parlor with the mistress and Miss Genevieve," Annie whispered, pulling Beatrice toward the door to peek down the corridor. But Miss Beatrice. He arrived with 2 footmen and a carriage crest so bright it blinded the butcher's boy across the street. In the lavish upstairs parlor, the scene was entirely different from Lady Margaret's fantasies. Arthur sat stiffly in a floral armchair, an aura of dark, intimidating power radiating from him that made the pastel room feel absurdly small. He was dressed flawlessly in a dark morning suit, his silver-topped cane resting between his knees. Lady Margaret was practically vibrating with joy. "Your Grace, this is such an unexpected honor. Genevieve and I were just speaking of your remarkable estate." "I will not take much of your time, Lady Margaret," Arthur cut in smoothly, his tone polite but chillingly authoritative. He had endured exactly 3 minutes of their simpering, and his patience was utterly exhausted. "I have come to call upon your household." Genevieve beamed, her cheeks flushing pink. Arthur's gaze drifted past her, settling coldly on Lady Margaret. "Specifically, I have come to call upon Miss Beatrice Linfield." The silence in the parlor was so profound that one could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Genevieve's smile shattered. Lady Margaret's jaw actually dropped, her face draining of color before flushing a violent, angry red. Beatrice?" Lady Margaret stammered, entirely unable to mask her shock and horror. "Your Grace, surely you are mistaken. You mean Genevieve." "I am rarely mistaken, madam," Arthur replied, his eyes narrowing slightly into a dangerous squint. "Miss Linfield, the young woman in the gray dress from last evening." "Is she at home?" Lady Margaret's mind raced. This was a disaster. If the Duke somehow fancied her miserable niece, Genevieve's chances were ruined. She had to shut this down immediately. A desperate, malicious lie formed on her tongue. "Oh, Your Grace, I am so deeply sorry," Lady Margaret lied smoothly, pressing a hand to her chest in a faux display of maternal sorrow. "Poor Beatrice. She is terribly ill. A weak constitution, you see. The embarrassment of last night was too much for her delicate nerves. I had her sent away to our country estate in Sussex, just this morning, on the very first train, for the fresh air." Arthur stared at her. He didn't blink. He could smell the lie like copper in the air. He saw the tight, panicked white lines around Lady Margaret's mouth and the furious, humiliated tears welling in Genevieve's eyes. "Sussex," Arthur repeated softly, his voice devoid of emotion. Yes, it is such a shame, Lady Margaret pressed, gaining confidence. But Genevieve is quite robust, and she was just hoping to show someone her new watercolor paintings. Arthur stood up smoothly, picking up his hat and cane. I see. Please pass on my wishes for Miss Linfield's swift recovery. Good day, Lady Margaret, Lady Genevieve. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the parlor, ignoring Lady Margaret's desperate attempts to call him back. As Arthur descended the grand staircase, his mind was already calculating his next move. He knew Beatrice was still in the house. He had noticed the fresh mud on the carriage wheels outside. They hadn't been to a train station today. He also noticed a young housemaid, Annie, dusting a table near the bottom of the stairs, watching him with wide, frightened eyes. Arthur paused at the bottom step. He reached into his inner pocket and produced a crisp, shockingly large 50-pound note, along with a small, folded piece of thick parchment. He stepped close to Annie, blocking her from the view of the upstairs landing. You, Arthur murmured, his voice incredibly quiet. Where is she? Annie swallowed hard, her eyes darting from the terrifyingly handsome Duke to the immense sum of money in his gloved hand. 50 pounds was more than she made in 3 years. The morning room, Your Grace, she breathed. Near the kitchens. They locked her in. A dark fury flared in Arthur's chest, cold and absolute, locked her in. Give this to her, Arthur commanded, slipping the note and the money into the maid's apron pocket, directly to her hands. If anyone else sees it, I will know. Do you understand? Annie nodded, frantically. Arthur turned and walked out the front door, his silver cane striking the marble steps with a sharp, decisive crack. The game had changed. He didn't just want a wife anymore to spite his cousin. He wanted the girl in the gray dress. And, heaven, help the people who stood in his way. 10 minutes later, Annie slipped into the damp morning room. Beatrice was back at her mending, her face pale. He left, Annie whispered, breathless. But Miss Beatrice, he left this for you. Beatrice's hands shook as she took the heavy parchment. It was sealed with black wax, bearing the crest of a wolf. She cracked it open. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and uncompromising. Miss Linfield. Your aunt informs me you are breathing the fresh air of Sussex. I suspect the air in the scullery is somewhat less refreshing. I am a man with very little time, and even less patience for games. Meet me tomorrow at 3 o'clock at the British Museum, in the Egyptian Antiquities Gallery. Tell no one. If you are not there, I will return to your aunt's house and tear the doors off their hinges myself to find you. Blackwood. Beatrice stared at the letter, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The most powerful man in London knew she was a prisoner in her own home, and he was demanding to see her. She looked down at her ruined hands, then back at the bold, dark ink of his signature. For the first time in her life, the invisible girl decided to step into the light. The great Russell Street entrance of the British Museum was shrouded in a thick pea soup fog the following afternoon. Beatrice slipped through the massive iron gates, pulling the hood of a borrowed woolen cloak low over her face. She had risked everything to be here. Escaping the Hastings townhouse had required bribing the scullery boy with her last 3 pennies to leave the tradesman's entrance unlatched. If she were caught, Aunt Margaret would likely throw her onto the cold London streets with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her heart hammered a relentless rhythm against her ribs as she navigated the echoing halls of the museum. Past the colossal winged lions of Assyria, she stepped into the Egyptian Antiquities Gallery. The air here was cool, smelling of ancient dust and polished stone. Huge, impassive statues of pharaohs stared down from their plinths. There, standing before the colossal granite head of Amenhotep III, was Arthur Pendleton. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat, a silk cravat perfectly knotted at his throat, and carried his silver-topped cane. In the dim light of the museum, he looked as dangerous and immovable as the statues surrounding him. Beatrice hesitated, her courage suddenly faltering. She was a ruined vicar's daughter in a borrowed, threadbare cloak. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man who regularly dined with the Prince of Wales and commanded armies of servants. The sheer absurdity of the situation threatened to crush her lungs. Arthur turned. His dark eyes locked onto her instantly, stripping away the gloom of the gallery. He didn't smile, but a subtle shifting in his rigid posture betrayed his relief. He closed the distance between them with long, deliberate strides. "You came," he stated softly, his gravelly voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. "You threatened to tear my aunt's doors off their hinges, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, her voice trembling slightly, though she kept her chin raised. "I thought it best to spare the mahogany." A flicker of amusement danced in Arthur's eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a searing intensity. "Walk with me, Miss Linfield." They moved slowly past the Rosetta Stone, the heavy silence of the gallery stretching between them. Arthur kept a respectable distance, yet his sheer presence felt overwhelming. "I am not a man who wastes time on pleasantries, Miss Linfield," Arthur began, his tone strictly business. "I require a wife by my 30th birthday, which is precisely 26 days from now. If I am not legally wed by the stroke of midnight, the unentailed portion of my fortune, including my ancestral home in Cornwall, defaults to my cousin, Nathaniel." Beatrice stopped walking. She stared at him, utterly stunned. "You are asking me to help you find a wife?" Arthur turned to face her fully, his gaze piercing. "I am asking you to be my wife." The gallery spun slightly. Beatrice gripped the edge of a stone display case to steady herself. "Your Grace, that is absurd. You could have any woman in England. The daughters of earls, marquesses." "I do not want the daughters of earls," Arthur interrupted sharply. "I have spent my life surrounded by women who see me only as a walking bank vault and a title. I saw how you acted at dinner. You sacrificed yourself to save a woman who despises you. You looked out for a servant rather than your own standing. You possess a quality entirely absent in London society: loyalty. I need a duchess I can trust. In return, I will offer you a life of absolute security. You will never mend another sheet, and you will never cower before your aunt again. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement." Beatrice's mind raced. It was a business transaction, cold, calculated, and entirely devoid of the romance she had foolishly read about in hidden penny dreadfuls. Yet, it was freedom. "And your cousin?" Beatrice asked carefully. "Nathaniel. What happens to him?" A dark shadow crossed Arthur's face. "Nathaniel is a parasite, a gambler drowning in debts to the city's worst moneylenders. He is counting on my failure. He will do everything in his power to stop this wedding if he learns of it." Beatrice looked down at her gloved hands. The worn fabric was fraying at the seams. She thought of the dark, windowless morning room. She thought of Genevieve's cruel laughter. "I have conditions," Beatrice said, her voice suddenly steady. She looked up, meeting the Duke's intimidating gaze without flinching. Arthur's eyebrows rose. "Name them." "I will not be a silent ornament," she stated firmly. "If I am to be your duchess, I will manage the household. I wish to be involved in the estate's charities, and I will not tolerate your mistresses, should you have them. If this is a partnership of trust, it must go both ways." Arthur stared at her for a long, silent moment. Most women would have simply fainted or wept with gratitude. This fierce, intelligent fire in her eyes was intoxicating. "I keep no mistresses, Miss Linfield," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously soft. "And I would never insult you by treating you as an ornament. We have an accord." He removed his leather glove and extended his bare hand. Beatrice slowly reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, strong, and sealing her fate. Unbeknownst to them, standing in the shadows behind a sarcophagus 20 yards away, a man in a rumpled brown suit watched the exchange. Nathaniel Pendleton smirked, his eyes glinting with a desperate, malicious light. He tipped his bowler hat to the statues and slipped away into the London fog. The Duke had found a bride, but Nathaniel had 26 days to destroy her. The following morning, Lady Margaret's drawing room was invaded not by an invitation, but by an army. Arthur arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, flanked by his formidable solicitor, Mr. Sterling, and 4 burly footmen wearing the Blackwood livery. Lady Margaret, who had been loudly lecturing Genevieve on the art of fanning oneself, froze as the Duke strode into the room without waiting to be announced. "Your Grace," Lady Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" "The meaning, madam, is extraction," Arthur said coldly. He didn't look at her, his eyes scanning the room. "Where is my betrothed?" "Your betrothed?" Genevieve whispered, her face draining to the color of spoiled milk. Arthur ignored her. He turned to Mr. Sterling, who stepped forward and dropped a heavy leather satchel onto Lady Margaret's pristine tea table. The clinking of solid gold coins echoed ominously. "My client," Mr. Sterling announced in a dry, nasal voice, "is prepared to offer you the sum of £10,000 to compensate for the sudden loss of your niece's services and to ensure your absolute silence regarding the nature of her departure." Lady Margaret's eyes bugged out of her head. £10,000 was a staggering fortune, but the realization of what it meant, that the invisible, wretched Beatrice had stolen the highest prize in the kingdom right out from under them, was a bitter pill to swallow. Before Lady Margaret could utter a protest, the drawing room doors opened. Beatrice stood there, her few worldly possessions packed into a single battered carpet bag. She wore her gray dress, but her posture had changed. Her spine was steel. Arthur walked past the spluttering Lady Margaret and stopped in front of Beatrice. He gently took the heavy carpet bag from her hand and passed it to a footman. Then, in full view of her tormentors, he offered her his arm. "Are you ready, my dear?" he asked, his voice deliberately loud enough to rattle the crystal chandelier. "I am, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. She did not look back at her aunt or cousin, as Arthur led her out of the house forever. Beatrice was established in the grand presidential suite of the Langham Hotel, chaperoned by Arthur's fiercely loyal, eagle-eyed aunt, Lady Agatha. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of velvet, silk, and diamonds. Arthur summoned the royal jewelers, Gerard & Co., to the hotel. He commissioned a staggering engagement ring, a flawless 3-carat sapphire surrounded by crushed diamonds, symbolizing the loyalty he demanded and the protection he promised. News of the Duke's sudden engagement to a nobody sent shockwaves through high society. The gossip columns of the Morning Post practically caught fire. Even Lady Randolph Churchill was overheard at a garden party, remarking that the Duke had either gone mad or found a hidden saint. But while Beatrice was fitted for silk gowns and learned the complex etiquette of her new station, a venomous plot was brewing in the dark corners of Mayfair. Nathaniel Pendleton had not been idle. He knew he could not simply kill his cousin. Arthur was too well guarded, and murder would bring the gallows. But ruining a reputation? That was Nathaniel's specialty. He needed Arthur to break the engagement himself. Nathaniel sought out the one person in London who hated Beatrice as much as he needed her. Ruined. Genevieve Hastings. They met in a secluded, dim booth at a tea room near Covent Garden. Genevieve, her face hidden behind a thick veil, listened with hungry, vindictive eyes as Nathaniel outlined his plan. "Arthur is a proud man," Nathaniel sneered, sipping his black tea. "He values loyalty above all. If he believes she is a fraud, a scheming opportunist who is carrying on an illicit affair while spending his money, he will cast her out into the gutter. The deadline will pass, and the estate will be mine. In return, Lady Genevieve, I shall ensure your family is heavily compensated from the Blackwood coffers." "How do we prove such a lie?" Genevieve asked, her voice trembling with dark excitement. "We don't need proof. We only need doubt." Nathaniel smiled, pulling a stack of letters from his coat. I have employed the finest forger in Cheapside. These letters are written in Beatrice's exact hand. They detail a passionate, ongoing affair with a fictional stable master and speak of her plot to rob the Duke blind once the vows are spoken. Genevieve snatched the letters, reading them with malicious glee. They are perfect. But how do we get them to the Duke? Not the Duke, Nathaniel corrected smoothly. We plant them in her chambers at the Langham, and then we ensure Arthur's solicitor accidentally discovers them. 2 days before the wedding, the trap was sprung. A maid at the Langham, heavily bribed by Nathaniel, slipped the forged letters beneath the mattress of Beatrice's bed. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel sent an anonymous, urgent tip to Mr. Sterling, suggesting that the future Duchess was hiding dangerous secrets in her bedchamber. The sky over London had turned the color of bruised iron, heavy with the threat of a violent summer thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the sudden, suffocating tension inside the Langham Hotel. The air in Beatrice's private sitting room was thick, smelling of burning coal and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Arthur stood in the exact center of the room, positioned like a statue carved from obsidian. His face was an entirely unreadable mask of cold, terrifying stillness. In his tightly gloved hands, he held the forged letters. Near the door, attempting to make himself as small as humanly possible, stood Mr. Sterling the solicitor, nervously wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his brow with a linen handkerchief. Beatrice stood frozen just inside the threshold. She had just returned from her final dress fitting. Her heart, light, and her mind filled with the unimaginable reality that tomorrow she would be a duchess. Now, the heavy carpetbag, the drafty scullery, and the vicious sneers of her aunt suddenly felt dangerously close, threatening to drag her back into the dark. "Arthur, you must believe me," Beatrice pleaded, the silence of the room pressing against her eardrums. Her voice cracked, betraying the sheer terror gripping her chest. "I have never laid eyes on those letters before in my life. I do not even know a stable master. I barely know how to ride a horse. This is a fabrication, a cruel, deliberate lie." Arthur remained completely silent. His dark eyes remained fixed on the parchment, his gaze scanning the ink with microscopic precision. The forgery was undeniably brilliant. The sweeping loops of the E's and the sharp crossing of the T's were identical to the brief notes Beatrice had sent him over the past fortnight regarding the wedding arrangements. To any other man, to a man ruled by ego and insecurity, it would be damning, absolute proof of a catastrophic betrayal. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. Beatrice's breathing grew shallow. She looked at the man she was supposed to marry, realizing with a sudden, sharp ache that it wasn't just the security she feared losing, it was him. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur lifted his head. He looked at Beatrice. He saw the genuine, raw terror swimming in her wide eyes, the slight tremble of her pale hands. He remembered the invisible girl in the ruined gray dress, throwing her own body into the path of a disaster to shield a woman who openly abused her. He remembered the fierce, uncompromising demand for mutual trust she had leveled at him in the shadowy corridors of the British Museum. Arthur turned on his heel and walked toward the roaring marble fireplace. "Your Grace!" Mr. Sterling gasped, stepping forward in a panic, his voice squeaking. "What are you doing? That is material evidence. If she is attempting to defraud the Blackwood estate, we must take this to the magistrate." Arthur did not even pause. He extended his hand and tossed the letters directly into the heart of the flames. Beatrice let out a jagged, trembling breath as the fire swallowed the heavy parchment. The edges curled, blackened, and turned to fragile gray ash, floating up the chimney. Arthur turned back to his solicitor, his voice dropping to a register that was like cracking ice on a frozen lake. "Mr. Sterling, you are unequivocally dismissed from my service. If you ever dare to bring me anonymous, cowardly garbage concerning my future wife again, you will not just be seeking employment in the colonies, You will be seeking it with 2 broken legs. Get out of my sight." Mr. Sterling turned the color of chalk, bowed so hastily he nearly tipped over, and fled the room, slamming the heavy door behind him. The room fell quiet once more, save for the crackling of the fire. Arthur walked slowly across the Persian rug until he was standing directly in front of Beatrice. Gently, he reached up and peeled off his leather gloves, tossing them onto a nearby table. He took her trembling hands in his warm, steady grip. "I told you the day we met, Beatrice, that I am not a fool," Arthur said softly, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his stoic facade. The letters were a masterful forgery. Visually, they were perfect, but the architect of this little scheme made several fatal errors. "What were they?" she whispered, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm. "First, the author of those letters entirely lacked your intelligence and your vocabulary," Arthur explained, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. The letters spoke of a fervent, burning bosom and clandestine midnight rendezvous. You, my dear, are far too pragmatic for such cheap, penny-dreadful melodrama. Second, the ink used was standard soot black, whereas I know for a fact you favor the indigo ink I had delivered to your writing desk last week. Arthur paused, his eyes darkening with a dangerous protective fury. And most importantly, the parchment reeked of cheap lavender water. A specific, overpowering scent favored exclusively by Lady Genevieve Hastings. Beatrice's eyes widened in horror. "Genevieve? But how? And who paid for the forgery?" "My cousin, Nathaniel," Arthur confirmed, his jaw tightening into a hard line. They played their final, desperate hand. They sought to inject poison into the one thing this marriage is built upon: trust. And they failed spectacularly. That evening, as Beatrice slept securely under the guard of the Blackwood men, Arthur paid a final, unannounced visit to the Hastings townhouse. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten violence. He simply sat in Lady Margaret's parlor and outlined, with chilling mathematical precision, exactly how he would dismantle their social standing, freeze their lines of credit, and ruin their family name if either of them ever breathed a single disparaging word about Beatrice again. By the time he left, Lady Margaret was weeping into her handkerchief, and Genevieve was staring at the floor in mute terror. As for Nathaniel, Arthur had quietly forwarded a list of his cousin's whereabouts to the most ruthless debt collectors in London. Nathaniel was currently boarding a rusted cargo ship bound for Calais in the dead of night, fleeing the country entirely. The 21st day since the Harrington dinner party dawned with brilliant, piercing sunshine, entirely banishing the gloom of the previous afternoon. St. George's, Hanover Square, was packed to the vaulted rafters with the most elite members of British society. The air was heavy and sweet with the scent of 10,000 white roses transported by private train from the Blackwood estates in Cornwall. Arthur stood at the altar, cutting an impossibly imposing figure in his formal duke's regalia, the dark velvet and gold braid emphasizing the broadness of his shoulders. The ticking clock in his mind, the suffocating anxiety over his father's draconian will had vanished entirely. As he looked down the long, carpeted aisle, he realized he was no longer doing this to save his estate. He was doing this because he could not imagine his life without her. The massive oak doors of the church swung open with a heavy groan. A collective audible gasp rippled through the hundreds of seated guests. Beatrice stepped into the light. She was no longer the invisible, forgotten girl in the mended wool dress. She wore a masterpiece of heavy ivory Duchess satin, encrusted with thousands of shimmering seed pearls and trimmed with priceless, antique Belgian lace. A magnificent, soaring diamond tiara, the legendary Blackwood heirloom, rested upon her dark, intricately pinned hair, catching the sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows and throwing prisms of light across the stone walls. She walked down the aisle with her head held high, radiating a quiet, undeniable majesty that commanded absolute respect. In the third row, Lady Margaret and Genevieve sat rigidly in their pews, their faces pale and pinched with a mixture of awe and absolute, crushing defeat. They were forced to watch the girl they had treated as a slave ascend to the highest ranks of the aristocracy. Beatrice reached the altar. Arthur stepped forward and took her hands, his dark eyes shining with a warmth and devotion that only she was permitted to see. "You look breathtaking," he murmured, his deep voice carrying only to her ears over the swelling music of the church organ. "I look like a duchess," she smiled softly, her eyes entirely fearless. "But I am still the girl from the shadows." "No," Arthur corrected gently, as the Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward, raising his hands to begin the sacred ceremony. "You are the light." The vows were spoken, deep, resonant, and unwavering. The heavy gold rings were exchanged, sliding into place with a sense of finality. As the massive clock tower outside began to chime the stroke of noon, signaling the exact deadline of the will, Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Blackwood, pulled his wife into his arms and kissed her. The contract was fulfilled. The vast estate was safe. But as Arthur and Beatrice walked back down the aisle together, out of the cool shadows of the church and into the roaring, joyous cheers of the London crowd waiting in the sunlit square, Beatrice knew the real victory had nothing to do with wills, inheritances, or titles. 3 weeks ago, she had been entirely invisible. Today, she was seen. She was fiercely loved, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never fade into the background again. Did you love Beatrice and Arthur's dramatic journey from the shadows to the altar? If this historical romance swept you off your feet, please hit that like button, share this story with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic tales of love, betrayal, and triumph.
Hi, my name is Primal Bond Living, the owner and manager of Primal Bond Living. After watching the video, The Duke Noticed the Invisible Girl at Dinner, 3 weeks later he married her, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of finally being seen after spending so long overlooked by everyone around you. I think a lot of people connect emotionally with stories like this because almost everyone knows what it feels like to be ignored, underestimated, or treated like they don't truly matter. That's what made the Duke noticing her feel so meaningful. Sometimes one person paying genuine attention can completely change someone's life and confidence. Do you think the Duke noticed something special in her that others failed to see? Or was he simply the first person willing to look beyond appearances and social status? And why do you think stories about quiet, overlooked characters finding love resonate so strongly with people? I think stories like this remind us how important it is to acknowledge the people around us, especially those who often feel invisible in everyday life. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy historical romance stories filled with emotional connection, quiet strength, and unexpected love, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.